We're privileged today to present Steve Hargadon as our keynote speaker. Steve is the director of the K-12 Open Technologies Initiative and the founder of Classroom 2.0 Social Network. Many of you will be familiar with Steve's initiatives, and in fact, I suspect many of you are already active in them. So a special welcome here to all of you who are participants in Classroom 2.0, and welcome, Steve.
Thanks so much. I have to say, Carol, I really love how you pronounce my last name. It's probably a lot closer to the way my grandparents have always said it than I do, but thanks for doing that. So the title for today's talk is that Web 2.0 is the future of education. And this talk actually started out for a conference in Illinois being titled Web 2.0 Tools in Education. It became, over the course of a few days, why Web 2.0 is critical to education. And then finally, in a moment of passion and late night brainstorming, became for me why Web 2.0 is the future of education. I'm hoping that by the end of the talk that you will have some perspective on that you'll give me some feedback as to whether or not you agree. Hopefully I'll have pushed the boundaries a little in terms of our understanding of the topic. And I thought the examples from the last session were really good, and I hope that what I will do is to provide a little bit of context for why those are so important. I think that we're about to have the biggest discussion about education that we've had in decades, maybe longer. And for me, that's because the tools of the web are changing how we're learning and how we think about what schools do. And why now? Why are these technologies so significant, and why do I think they're going to have such an impact? My wife and I last year attended the basketball game of our then 13-year-old daughter. And we were sitting in the stands, and my wife looked down at this group of kids who were paying no attention to the basketball game and were they all had their cell phones or handheld devices out. And they were texting, and they were taking photos, and they were zooming stuff back and forth. And my wife looked at me and she said, that's terrible. She said, those kids aren't paying any attention to the game. And I kind of laughed, and I said, well, I don't remember paying a lot of attention to basketball games in junior high. That for us would be junior high school. And what's interesting to me is that they're holding in their hands a device that we've dreamt of for decades. This is the Star Trek communicator. It's the Dick Tracy watch. The cell phone for these kids does so many incredible things that we've dreamed of for so long that if they weren't interested in them, I'd be worried about them. Of course they're interested. I'm interested. It's exciting and fascinating. All of the things that can be done with these handheld tools. So one thing I think that we know is that when we invent tools, that they can reinvent us, that we discover something and it recreates us. The telephone and television have so dramatically changed everything that we do, the car, and especially technologies that seemed frightening when they began. I wish I could remember where, and I've desperately searched to find the reference, but I remember reading that the novel was seen as a corrupting influence because the factory girls were reading these novels in the factories. And we obviously look at the novel as an enormously important part of education. The television, for all of the difficulties that television can create, it's an incredible tool, and we would never throw out the television just because there are some difficult aspects to it. And I think that we're going to say the same thing about the read-write web, and we're going to really want to promote the positive aspects of it, because if we aren't actively working to use them in educationally important ways, then we're defaulting, or we're giving that power away to others, marketers or those who are less interested in the welfare of students, to actually define their use. So from my perspective, Web 2.0 and the Internet are becoming a platform for unparalleled creativity. And interestingly enough, we're creating the new content of the web. The best applications are actually just frameworks in which we are creating the material that goes within that framework. So I want to identify 10 trends that I think are going to have a profound impact on education. The first is that I believe we're in the middle of a new publishing revolution. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. The advent of the printing press, I think, will in some ways be seen as less revolutionary than Web 2.0. This picture is my perception of Web 1.0. This is a view of the web where we are recipients of material on the web. So the principles of Web 1.0 would be reading, receiving, and researching. We are definitely in recipient mode in Web 1.0. And as was well expressed early on this morning, or this morning for you in Australia, in the first session, Web 2.0 is really the read-write web, where we are contributing, we're collaborating, and we're creating. Now, the phrase Web 2.0 comes from Tim O'Reilly, who used it to define why certain offerings or companies survived the dot-com bust. And clearly it was intended to be a marketing term. But I do think it really represents something of significance, the difference between the way that I used the web over the last 10 years and the way my children use the web. You know, for me, I was definitely a recipient of material, and for them, almost everything they do is about contribution. They're putting up photos. They are commenting on each other's photos. They're using the framework of MySpace and Facebook to interact with each other, and they are very much in an active mode where the web is a medium to which they contribute. So in 1436 AD or thereabouts, the printing press revolutionized the transmission of the printed word. And essentially what it did was it took the cost of publishing down to a level at which it was much more affordable. So that instead of having to hire people to copy manuscript or documents, you could actually mass produce. And I think that the accepted figures that it was the equivalent of about $5,000 or $6,000 to buy a printing press in those days. And Web 2.0 could be defined as further reducing that cost down to zero. It's essentially zero. We buy a computer if we need to, but if I wanted to, I could go to the public library here in town, and I could, using free tools, could actually put material on the web for free. And so at its first level, Web 2.0 brings the cost of publishing down to zero. But what's interesting for me is that I don't really think that's the primary change. That's just changing the cost of publishing. For me, the fascinating aspect of Web 2.0 is that it's actually changing the nature of publishing. Publishing going from being a medium of a one-way communication primarily to being a conversation. Now, this is a Kindle, and many of you probably recognize it. It's offered by Amazon as a downloadable book reader. And I think that we're at a place where things are really going to start getting interesting. because the Kindle is so close to being something else that the moment we recognize what it is, I think we will see how this is going to dramatically change how we communicate. Right now, I can download a book on the Kindle and I can read it, and I can annotate that book. But what will happen when someone else reading the book can see my annotations? When the book ceases to be just a book, but it becomes the focus place or the center place for a conversation around the ideas in the book. It's already an internet-connected device. Yes, and somebody just put up their Kindle equals Digo. This is, I think, will be an inevitable change in how we view publishing. When reading an article or reading a book, we actually can make a comment on something and other readers can see that comment. We're already doing it on Amazon. It's not very slick, it's not very easy, but we are communicating with each other about books on Amazon. And what we're seeing is that when I go to a site like Amazon, I'm not going for the content that the publisher puts up there. I'm not looking, I read the Publisher's Weekly or the Book Jacket reviews for the book, but what I really care about is what other readers have to say about the book. And what I'm really looking for is to be in a conversation with those readers and the author about the topic. And that's why I think the revolution that we're experiencing is much more than just a change in the cost of publishing. I think it's turning publishing into a conversation, that the World Wide Web is becoming a conversation. And that in our interactions with each other, we're discovering some really amazing things when we're talking with each other. Okay, trend number 2 is that we're about to hit a tidal wave of information. Those of us who were in this session probably already are experiencing that. But I think it's we don't have any idea of just how much and how fast it's going to hit. There will be undoubtedly more information than we could ever possibly get through, even on some of the most minute topics. Here's my picture of a tidal wave hitting us. Okay, so this is Wikipedia. We're probably pretty familiar with it. And, you know, the best estimates of how many people who are at Wikipedia actually contribute to Wikipedia is somewhere in the 1 to 2% range. So what's it going, and think of all of the topics already in Wikipedia. What's it going to do, what's it going to be like when 10 to 20% of people contribute to Wikipedia? And again, Wikipedia just being one website. What's it going to be like when 30 to 40% contribute? What's it going to be like when we actually start having students contribute? Now, we understand that Wikipedia is not original material. You have to have a source for putting something up, but it's a great learning environment. And at some point in time, we're going to discover that kids can actually be contributors. The volume of material available to us is going to be overwhelming. So the answer to how we're going to deal with this tidal wave of information is going to have to come from Web 2.0. And I want to make a little bit of a bold statement. It's a paradox. But I believe that the answer to content overload is actually teaching how to produce content. That we're going to be very much at a disadvantage in dealing with content. Our students will be and we will be if we don't understand how content gets produced. And that when we produce content, it focuses us, it gives us an ability to participate in the discussion, and we become discerning, and we become engaged, and we have a better understanding of how to manage content. So my paradoxical answer to how are we going to deal with content overload is that we're going to have to teach the production of content. Yes, we need great librarians, absolutely. So the third trend that I think is significant right now is that we are in a culture of increased openness. This is Tux the penguin. He's the symbol for Linux and often by default of open source software. And we are seeing a changed model of value in business. In this culture of openness, this is a picture of the release of water from a dam. We're discovering an enormous amount of latent energy being released. A good example for me is Craigslist. The enormous amount of interest and activity by putting classifieds into an electronic form is going to be, I think, repeated over and over and over again as we discover that the technologies release energy where we all want to participate. I mean, I think we can say with some thoughtfulness that Wikipedia is really not, at this point, a medium that invites us to become full participants. But there are tools that do, and as they do, that I think we're going to discover that this is something innately human about us, that we want to communicate and we want to produce content, we want to be creative, and it's going to release, it's going to open the floodgates to contributions of interest and scholarship and communicating with each other. This is the old trusted media, and I think what we're seeing now with Wikipedia is a new kind of open media. We're going from authority to transparency, and in transparency, the more information you have, the better. So in the case of the Virginia Tech Massacre page on Wikipedia, you can go in and see not only the discussion about the information that was placed on the single page, but you can see who made what changes and how they occurred over time. And in the old trusted media environment, we just read the first page. So in the new environment of openness, we're now able to see much more about why we're being given certain kinds of information and how we can discern what's important and what's not from that. Trend number 4, in many ways similar to the culture of openness, is a culture of participation. The technologies of the internet really inherently promote participation. And for me, Amazon is sort of the first and great example of that. Our ability to leave reviews and then to actually have that content become and arguably the most important aspect of the site. The content from the users is the primary value in Wikipedia. In Amazon.com and in Wikipedia. The 5th trend is the age of the collaborator. And here's my token collaboration slide. I think that historical periods of time favor specific traits. If I'd been born 150 years ago, I think they would likely have taken me out behind the woodshed and put me out of my misery. I can't digest milk. I have had blood clots in one leg. I had an Achilles, I snapped my Achilles tendon. I have vitiligo, which is not too rare, but oftentimes unknown skin disorder, which takes away my pigment, so if I'm out in the sun, I burn. And really, if I had been on the Pioneer Trail, they would have seen me as a huge liability. I would not have been very helpful. But in this age, with the computer, I'm able to participate, and I'm inherently collaborative. And I feel as though history is kind to me right now because of those character traits. I have a son who is not very academic, who would have been great on the Pioneer Trail. And by the randomness of time and birth, will have to find his way with a little more difficulty than I've had to at this time. And so I think we need to recognize that right now we are in a different period of time that will favor specific traits, and we need to help our students to develop those traits. This is a famous picture. Many of you have probably seen it. This is the original Microsoft staff. it's hard to imagine this group 200 or 300 years ago producing one of the strongest entities in the world. And certainly our time favored them. So I've created a law, and I'm sure I haven't really created it, someone else has, and I'm just taking credit for it till I'm corrected. But my Hargadon's Web 2.0 law is that the wisdom of the group is replacing the expert. That we can have a meeting like this, that we can be chatting, that we can be discussing things together. I'm finding that in these meetings there is a level of group wisdom which surprises and sometimes astonishes me, and that we get to really incredible conclusions that previously would have required an expert, but now are sort of the wisdom of the crowd or the wisdom of the group. And that I think that this is really significant, and I think it's significant that these technologies are going to elicit that kind of capability of groups to draw amazing conclusions and to do really good work together. Okay, so trend number 6 I call an explosion of innovation. And this is my younger brother, who is a professor of business at University of California at Davis, and who wrote a book that was very well received called How Breakthroughs Happen. He's kind of an expert on innovation. And one of the points that he brings out in his book is that consultants have often played a very key role in innovation, because they move from company to company, carrying with them ideas and understanding from one industry into another industry that hasn't seen that before. And the innovation is often just the application of something learned in one area and applied in another. What I think is fascinating about what we're experiencing today is that we are, in many ways, our own corporate entities, that by virtue of our ability to be uniquely involved in different discussions, that we bring with us the background, history, books, thoughts, ideas to discussions, and that there's innovation taking place all of the time. If you attend any kind of an unconference with educational bloggers, it's just phenomenally, these discussions are phenomenally productive. The ideas are great. The implementation is fast. Again, the tools are allowing us to connect with each other and to bring our whole selves to those connections. If I read a book just because my daughter's reading it in school and I want to read it to support her, I'm discovering that I can actually bring the principles of that book very quickly into almost every interaction that I have. And that this is, if this definition of innovation is accurate, I think we're going to see a tremendous amount of innovation because it will take place on very small scales. So we're also changing how things get done. If you take the words professional and amateur and you put them together, you get the pro-am culture. And if you take producer and consumer, you get the prosumer culture. And we are seeing a change in how products get manufactured and how services get offered. And this change reflects a shifting of perception between the professional and the amateur, that those boundaries are getting fuzzy. A great example of this was the mountain bike. That the mountain bike was really created by amateur riders who wanted to ride bikes down mountains and built their own, and they had to repack the bearings frequently, and I think they even called them repack races or something because of that. But then the manufacturers kind of came along and said, we can mass produce this and make it easier. So we've seen this before. We also see it quite a bit in astronomy. The amateur astronomy contingent is very strong and very active. In fact, some months ago there was an article about a discovery of a new planetary system that had come from looking right next to large stars and then being able to see past them much further because of the bending of the light, and that they were discovering new planetary systems that actually potentially could house life. And what I loved about that was that in those articles, the 2 or 3 that I read about the same discovery, each one mentioned that it was a housewife in Australia who had been part of the discovery. So we know this culture, but what I think is going to happen is it's going to become even more pronounced. The distinction between an amateur and a professional is going to become fuzzier, and that more and more our world will work by combining forces. And we want our students to be in a position to proactively be involved in that. The world will favor those who are proactive and who are collaborative and can play a part in what are historically, I think, enormously significant changes. Okay, trend number 7, the world is getting flatter and faster. And we don't have to spend any time on this. Someone I know said, yes, it's getting flatter, but it's also spiky and wrinkled. I agree. It's still pretty darn flat. That you can now study courses at from MIT in their project. That I can sit in a room in San Francisco with a group of educators and at a moment's notice Skype in other educators from around the world to talk with us. Makes the world amazingly flat. That Chris Kraft and others can have students in a Spanish class or another language class actually producing oral reports for students in Peru or who are native speakers of that language. To me, the world is really getting flat, and I think it's a huge benefit to our students and children, and they will have something that we didn't have growing up, that will make education significantly more profound for them as they put it into application. Okay, trend number 8 is the long tail. And we have a common way of thinking about the long tail, and I'm sorry the slide, the way the transparency worked coming into Illuminate didn't hold. But essentially what this slide shows is the concept of the long tail, where you have a power law curve. And in this case, looking at books and music, the cost of distribution to get those songs or music or books into a physical store is high enough that only a certain percentage of the actual music being produced is going to make it. And what the long tail tells us is that the moment that you reduce those distribution costs and make all of the material available, there's still quite an audience for a lot of that material, and that audience will materialize. The covered over portion here would show you that, I think at the time of this slide, which comes from Chris Anderson's site, that 57% of Amazon sales now come from product that would not be offered in a store. Now, when we talk about the long tail, I think we think primarily of, but related to education, I think we think primarily of the opportunity for students to study a significantly broader number of topics. If we can only afford to bring into our schools 2 or 3 foreign language teachers, or whatever other specialty topic teachers, the moment that we have online learning, then a student could take Chinese who would not normally take Chinese. And that may be our primary view. The view that intrigues me, though, is that in this long tail of interest, there's a huge opportunity for students to actually be participants, not to be learning as preparation for being adults, but actually to participate in topics where they become one of the people in the world who is studying that topic. My daughter, for a History Day project, did a report on an ancestor of my wife's named Anne Hutchison, who was a significant figure in U.S. history, but not of huge importance, but she was considered to be a witch, but she was just a very forward-thinking woman. And when my daughter did this project, she did it as a website, and she has one of the few websites on Ann Hutchison. Now, it's not of the same caliber. At age 14, it was not of the same caliber as some of the other sites out there, but she actually became a participant in the building of knowledge around something of importance. And this long tail, I think, represents a huge opportunity for students to actually be participants, to actually be a part of what takes place. You can now go online and you can watch surgical procedures, which means that a student can develop an interest early on in something that would never be offered in a traditional high school, and start to become an expert and start to have understanding. Global Scholar is one of many sites where you can go online and receive instruction. There's sort of a marketplace of tutors. This says to me that the opportunity for students is unparalleled, that there's never been a period of time in history when there's been such an ability to develop an interest in something, to learn about it, to become an expert, and then to potentially make a living or a career out of it. These were pictures of what I thought represented apprenticeship and mentoring, which we typically thought of as being associated with the trades. When we can have students focus on topics where they can find a graduate student who will mentor them through Skype or online, then we will look increasingly toward this kind of mentorship and apprenticeship in students actually developing skills. Okay, trend number 9, social learning moves toward center stage. Now, a number of the ideas from this talk came to me from reading material by John Seeley Brown, and I'll put up a link to one article of his that I don't think I have it prepared. I'll put up the link to my blog post which relates to this talk, and then you can see the reference to John C. Brown's material in there. But he makes the point, and others have too, that it's not what takes place in the lecture hall that really stays with students. It is what takes place in the hallway or in the study group. And in this article that you'll find cited there, he also talks about the fact that the study group is considered by many to be a real determinant of success in college. And interestingly enough, there appears to be a very high correlation between the effectiveness of physical study groups and virtual study groups, which leads us to a fascinating conclusion, which is that the ability to meet together online can be a significant, around academic topics, can be a significant determinant of academic success. And that, I think, is going to be an intriguing proposition for us to look at and play out. But clearly, social learning is becoming, through the tools of these technologies, is becoming more and more talked about and more understood. It's not new, but the technologies so inherently facilitate and promote this. Trend number 10 for me is social networking. Now, I want to make the case that what we've thought of as social networking has really not been fair. That MySpace and Facebook have kind of co-opted the term social networking, but there really is something significant going on here. Social networking is really the aggregation of a number of internet tools in one place for the purpose of creating connections and community building. And MySpace and Facebook and Orchid and others have done a great job with that. And that may make us a little wary of bringing social networking into education. But I think we're going to find that it is an enormously effective tool. Blogs were really sort of the first way that a regular person could contribute material on the web. They began as weblogs or listings of places that people had visited on the web, and that they were making a record for others to find great sites. And that became a blog, and it has this inherently chronological structure, and it's not great at conversation, meaning it typically promotes the voice of the blogger, and those who come and make comments aren't really fully in a conversation. They're hoping to get noticed, and sometimes works better than others. But as imperfect as blogging is, it's an incredible thing, because it's really the first time that we could so readily and easily put up good-looking content on the web and to communicate with each other. I call blogging, I refer to blogging as walking on stilts a little. It's not super easy to learn, but it's really fun, and probably the analogy doesn't truly hold, because there is such a value in blogging. I'm not sure there is in walking on stilts, maybe seeing over things. But also, like walking on stilts, as Darren Draper's reminded me recently, it does put the person who's blogging a little bit above other people. Then came wikis, and wikis are a web page with an edit button. That's Adam Fry says that, and maybe others have too, but I got that from Adam. And what the wikis did is they actually allowed for structured publishing of material, again through this free content web services. And there are different levels to the wiki, and we tend to think, very quickly of Wikipedia. But Wikipedia is really the highest form for me of the use of a wiki. And we don't necessarily need to go there where we're editing each other's writings for a wiki still to be enormously productive. Even just a single person using a wiki, it allows for this sort of continuous improvement of content. You can put it up and structure it, and then make changes and enhance it and change it. At the second level, 2 or 3 people can gather together and delegate out different pages, or a teacher can actually delegate out to students the building of different pages for different information and material. So the wiki was next, but the social, and I call using wikis like juggling. It took me a year to figure out how to use a wiki. I was even a little intimidated, and I consider myself to be something of a wiki warrior now. Okay, but then came social networking. And what's interesting about social networking is that it emotionally hit a chord that allowed a lot of people who hadn't done blogs and hadn't used wikis to actually get involved and put content on the web. And we may have quibbles with what kind of content is getting put on MySpace, but the numbers are incredible. If you look at the statistics, and these are a few months dated, 120,000 new blogs are created each day. MySpace gets, let me use my little indicator here. MySpace gets 375,000 new members every day. So something on the order of 3 times as many people start just a MySpace page as actually start blogging. And for good reason. You can start a MySpace page very easily, and you can be very creative, whereas it takes a fair amount of time. If I have helped someone run a blog, I'm really doing a fair amount of hand-holding to do that. If MySpace were a country, it would be almost as populous as the United States. Now, it took a long time for me to even find statistics about MySpace, and I can't say that these are 100% accurate, but whether or not it's the 6th most populous country or the 3rd, it's still an incredible achievement for a single product. So social networks have really been amazing. This is an early screenshot of Classroom 2.0. And for those of you who haven't been and want to go, Classroom 2.0 is here. Classroom 2.0 now has over 9,900 members. Maybe your conference will get us to 10,000. Wouldn't that be a fun milestone? But these are almost 10,000 people who are interested in the use of Web 2.0 in education. That to me is amazing. Well, it was amazing to me when we had 445 members. But to think that we can gather 10,000 people around the use of a certain kind of technology in education is amazing. Now, dream with me a little. What will it be like when you can have 10,000 history teachers talking to each other? or when you can have 10,000 biology teachers, or whatever the numbers are, even in the hundreds, for educators to collaborate with each other on specific topics. This, to me, is phenomenal. And it would be very hard to get this many educators to start blogging, because the hurdles to blogging are significant, and the audience is very limited once you start blogging. But if you go into Classroom 2.0 and you post a forum post, you're really likely to get a response, and then you're a part of the conversation. So I think that social networking is our 10th and significant trend. So why does this all matter? Learning is changing. My own personal learning has changed. My use of Web 2.0 is changing how I learn and how I communicate with others. And education is going to have to change too. We will not feel good if students are turning off their best learning when they go to school. They have to be able to learn the tools of this new knowledge society, and they have to be taught to use them well. And we have to be proactive in helping to make this happen. The factory model of schooling really made sense when we were a factory society, when we looked at students as raw input and we modeled our educational system on the way that our factories produce materials. But our factories don't produce materials that way anymore. Our business world is no longer a factory business world. The parents and students are not going to be satisfied being taught the same thing at the same speed with those of the same age. And this is hard. We're going to have to figure it out. But our customized, collaborative, creative society will require that our educational system be customized and collaborative and creative. We face a danger, and the danger is that, like the music industry, education becomes the opposite of what it originally was. The recording industry, as Clay Shirky tells us, for years made it possible to easily get inexpensive music. And in the last few years, they've become the organization that has made it less possible to get music easily. Now, there are good reasons for that, and there are a lot of difficult licensing issues, but the recording industry's focus has basically become stopping the transmission of music. And we have to make sure that with all the legal issues that schools face, with the difficulties that they feel, that schools don't actually become institutions that stop the learning that's taking place. I expect some jabs on that one. Okay, so what can you do? And Tamara, I'm almost done, so I think our timing is good. Students need you more than ever. I think the tendency is to believe that the students know more about this technology and that there's not a whole lot we can do to help them. I think the reality is that they need us more than ever. They need those who have become content experts and who love learning and knowledge to teach them how to drill down and to get past the surface level and to get past the Wikipedia front page and how to become an expert in something and how to manage information. So more than ever, they need us to become involved. It may scare us. The technologies may seem foreign to us, but we have to make sure that we are actively involved in helping them to use the technology as well. There are 7 things that I would propose that you can do as educators. The first is to learn about Web 2.0. Find out what it is. Many of you here probably already are, but as you are talking to others, encourage them to learn about Web 2.0. Let's not leave this in the domain of the marketers and the kids. This is too important. If my thesis that this is historically more important than the advent of the printing press, then we all need to get involved. And I know it's another set of things to learn, and it's it's more energy expended. But this one I think is really important. We need to lurk. Lurking is good. There's no negative to lurking. If you are nervous, if you spent 30 years evaluating other people on their writing, so you're really nervous about putting something up that will be on the web forever, lurk and watch how conversations go and see that the web is becoming more about conversations than it is about publishing. Third would be to participate. Get in and actually play. You won't understand how these technologies are transformative of learning until you've actually used them. Come into Classroom 2.0, start a blog, play with a wiki, and see just how exciting it is to be proactively involved in these tools. Think about my thought of the answer to information overload is to produce more information. Push back on me on this one. Challenge me. There's an old famous quote that the cure to the ills of democracy is more democracy. I think that the cure to the ills of information overload is teaching how to produce information. That pile of information is not going to get any smaller. So as we learn to produce information, while we are adding to the sum total, we're actually learning how content is created and how it gets used. Teach content production. This should be something we should be teaching. We should be teaching students how to produce content that others see. Peer review, even if it's just in the class. I have a box full of papers that I wrote in high school and college that only my mom and my teachers saw. My wife wants me to throw them away, and I keep saying no. I wanted an audience. Kids want an audience. They're writing all the time. It's incredible how much they're communicating through writing. So we need to help them learn to do that effectively and well. Number 6, make education a public discussion. We need to be talking about education. It needs to be in the forefront of the issues of the day. We need to be talking about how to be effective in teaching, how to be effective in creating a society in which learning is important. And then finally, help to build the new playbook. Using Web 2.0 in education is going to require that we figure out ways to do it well and that we collaborate together to produce resources that showcase how you do these things well. How do you use a wiki well? How do you use a blog well? And there are lots of good places to do that, and come into Classroom 2.0 and we'll share them. I hope you have a great learning day for those of you whose day has just started, and thanks for giving me your time and attention today.
Thank you, Steve. That was fantastic. And would you please join me in thanking Steve using your applause buttons to thank Steve for his very interesting and stimulating talk. I'm sure that we'll have plenty of questions. So I'd like to invite some questions. We've got about 10 minutes now to take questions, and then we'll take a short break, and Mark Landy, my colleague, will come back and lead a panel to look at some of Steve's ideas in a little bit more detail and continue the discussions then. But go ahead if you have a question and raise your hand. Christy, do you have a question? Please go ahead. Okay, I'm wondering if Christy had meant to be using her. Okay, that's fine, Christy. You can use the text area to put your question in. And do you have a question, Polly? Go ahead and use your mic. Okay, nobody is raising their hand to ask a question. So I've picked out a few comments that have come through the text, which I might put to you. And I noticed Andrew Gouch's comment there. Andrew, would you like to talk more to Steve about some of those ideas there? Go ahead. Okay, Andrew's actually in class at the moment. Fantastic. Mark has a question. Go ahead, Mark.
Hi, Steve. Can you talk a bit more about how do we talk about education? I think we're very good at talking at people rather than with. Might you talk about how we might develop a shared language around some of the concepts and learning you've been talking about here this morning? Thanks.
I think that's a really good question. I've been holding a number of workshops where we use a wiki to organize the workshop and allow people to to express both what they want to learn and what they'd be interested in teaching. And that model may not be a bad one for creating dialogue. I understand that when I talk about Web 2.0 as the future of education, that's not an easy concept for a lot of people. And so I hope that part of what I do is to try and give historical context to that and leave myself open to having a discussion about it, so that you might say to me, well, I agree with this and I don't agree with that, so that we might work together. And so maybe that's one way to start, is to provide a forum for a discussion where you can introduce the ideas, but you're not necessarily saying to people, I know what's right, but let's get together and talk about the changes we're seeing in society and how they'll impact our students. I'm feeling brave enough to leave the video on now because we're just answering questions and I'm having to look at my notes.
Thank you for that, Steve. And we do have a couple of questions now. I think people were pausing to gather their thoughts. So go ahead, Karen.
Oh, good, Karen. I love this idea that Karen just responded in the chat there. Could you expound a bit more regarding what you mean as the answer to information overload is to produce more information? I think if we see the problem as the quantity of information, that answer doesn't make sense, to produce more information. But if the real issue is how do we discern what information is worth looking at and how do we become thoughtful consumers of that information, then what we're saying is we need to teach the production of information, meaning that the student learns to create something. They learn how hard it is to actually write something that makes sense and that will communicate with people. And they can also find out where you would look for information. So where do they put their information? A great example for me of this is licensing. My children don't really have a good sense of respecting the rights of people who have created licensed content. And it's especially true in the music industry, and Apple made it even harder because you can copy songs from iTunes. So the question, is how do you help students understand licensing? Well, if they actually produce material and have to choose a license for it, then they go through the process of understanding what licensing is. And the same for me with information. The chat's going by too fast. I know Corey had a comment there.
Thanks for that, Steve. Maureen, did you have a question? Would you like to use the microphone to ask your question?
Sure. My question is about distractibility and attention. With all the different tools and all the different things we try to do at once, how are we drilling down and getting deeper, or are we distracting people?
I think that's a really great question. And the argument I would make is that you're exactly right, that there are so many rich technologies that they are very distracting. And so part of what we need to do is to help our students understand how to get beyond the distraction stage. And it won't happen if we're not actively involved. So typically, I find that educators will pick one or two technologies, like a wiki or a blog, and really spend time on that and learn how it gets used, knowing that those skills of content production, of involvement, of peer work will translate into other technologies.
Thanks for that, Steve. And Corey, did you have a question? Go ahead.
Hey, Steve. Just had a question about if you have any strategies for going against district filters.
Did you say district filters? So I don't know that I'm really qualified to answer that. Is there somebody else here who's had some success in communicating the value of some of these technologies to help people see beyond the gut reaction to filter?
Would somebody like to use the mic to answer that question? Otherwise, go ahead, Smirnova.
Oh, actually, my question was still almost the same. How to deal with fear of administration and how to deal with blockers. The student teachers from schools, from the college, they would go and use wikis and blogs, and then there will be a lot of feedback, negative feedback. Administrators or sometimes classroom teachers are afraid of using wiki or blogs. So how deal with this problem?
So for me, at least, I try and talk about how previous technologies have engendered some of the same fears. And there's no question that there are things that we're not going to want in our schools from the web. At the same time, if we don't proactively use them in positive ways, then we've abdicated the use of those tools to others. And so hopefully, providing a platform for discussion around that and saying, these are really important tools. If you go into the business world and you ask what character traits they're looking for in students, those traits have really changed in the last 20 years. It's intriguing to me that when I graduated from high school in 1979, and really, if you nodded your head and didn't get into trouble and you did what people told you to do, that was the route to success, or a route, or one of the significant routes to success. And what I worry about a little today is that our expectations for our workforce are much higher than that. We want proactive workers. And we're not going to get proactive workers unless we provide opportunities for students to be proactive in their work at school, in their education. And so we're going to want to use these tools. And the question just is, can we figure out a way to do it together that we're all comfortable with?
Thanks for that response. And there's also a lot of suggestions in the text chat there, which are giving a really good kind of range of approaches there. Craig, you had a question. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. I've got a quick comment and a question for Steve. Regarding Wiki and the question of credibility of information, I'm reminded of how the original Oxford Dictionary was itself a collaborative exercise where folk were asked to collect, define, and also the usage of words and to send it in on cards. But I'm also aware that this is a certain type of knowledge, that is to say, knowledge that rests on conventions and usage. And I was wondering, Steve, if you could talk a little bit more about, two parts really, ways of telling the worth of information, and also, are there other sorts of knowledge or information where this notion of, if you will, a collaborative sort of pooling doesn't work as well? I'll leave it there.
Tamara, I'm thinking that would be a great question to use to start the Q&A or panel discussion. Would you like to do that?
Yep, that's fine with me. Craig, if you're happy waiting for that response, and perhaps we could ask you to raise that question again in the next session. And we've got one other person with a hand up, and that's Terry. So, Steve, are you happy to take one more question, and then we'll stop and take a short break before the panel?
Absolutely. And Craig, I wasn't trying to put you off. I was just thinking that deserves a longer answer than the time we have.
I'm sure Craig won't be put off, Steve. Terry, go ahead with your question.
Okay, this goes back to Corey's comment a few minutes ago. Very quickly, though, Corey had asked about blockers and what strategies people might have had. I've found that in our district, it's really an individual effort. For example, in my classroom, I've been able to have blocking turned off completely because I Skype a lot and I do a lot of blogging, a lot of wikis and everything, but that's only because I presented a convincing case. And so as more and more teachers are coming forth with plans and showing what they can do, that's been the case. They've been allowed to turn them off. But overall, the answer to that is no, they're just totally blocked.
It's a very hard issue.
Thank you very much for those comments there, Terry. And we are going to take a short break now. And I would like to once again thank Steve for his fantastic presentation and for giving us many things to speak about. And I'd like to invite you to please use your hand clapping tool to thank Steve. And we will be taking a short break.